And the dialogue in this film is not great either. And I suppose in retrospect, it somewhat makes me appreciate that there's actually so little spoken dialogue in the later John Wick films, particularly from Keanu Reeves, who seems to be getting just worse and worse and worse throughout that series in terms of his acting performance. But really, it just kind of made me miss the cheesy, fun dialogue of an Arnold Schwarzenegger action film like Commando, Terminator, or even Predator.
Yeah! Stick around.
Let's go ahead and move on to the next part of my show, and let's jump into my review for The Beekeeper, a film coming out in the month of January, written by the guy who wrote last year's Expendables, and also 2012's Total Recall remake, directed by David Ayer, whose recent films include Suicide Squad, and no, it's not the good one. Also the film Bright, which presented the concept of what if black people were orcs.
Some days I close my eyes and fade away. I'm not afraid.
And starring Jason Statham, who is in 2 of my top 10 worst movies of 2023. The Meg 2, and also funny enough, Expendables 4, or Expendables. It popped up again. That's very nice indeed. Just a recipe for success right there. To provide you with a brief background of this film, a synopsis, if you will. When Jason Statham's only black friend dies due to a manipulative phishing scam, he commits himself to a brutal campaign of vengeance and violence, while more information is steadily revealed about the clandestine organization he once belonged to, the Beekeepers. To get in the positives first, I like the basic premise and setup of the movie. Jason Statham, plays a retired special forces guy who belonged to this secret organization called the Beekeepers. He retired and coincidentally also happened to become a beekeeper, which is not an obligation. And when you leave the organization, you don't have to become a beekeeper. He just became a beekeeper. He's not much of a people person in the beginning of the film, but he struck up a very friendly and warm relationship with this elderly woman played by Felicia Rashad, good old Mrs. Huxtable chap, who is his only friend. Not only his only black friend, Chad, his only friend. She ends up getting scammed by these phishing bros, these tech bros, who say she has a virus on her computer, and they steal her entire life savings like that, which then causes her to kill herself immediately afterward. I don't know if I would have done that immediately. I would have maybe called some people, but she's like, well, that's it. and she kills herself. Yes, it's a simple opening. And it's very reminiscent of John Wick, which this movie borrows liberally from in all sorts of ways. But it does get you invested. We've all encountered these scammers ourselves, or know people who have encountered them, or had relatives deal with this, especially the elderly, who I think are easily preyed upon by these groups. I mean, my own grandmother on my father's side, she had a situation, she dealt with something like that, and it scared her. And again, when you hear about something like that, it just pisses you off. You're then as motivated as Statham to seek vengeance against these people and see them just ripped apart in bloody, gory, horrific fashion. And this movie does that to an extent. You get some nice bloody kills, some goopy body horror, a few good action scenes, though the editing, I have to say, can be a little choppy for some of them. Additionally, to still be positive, chat, I really like Josh Hutcherson a lot in this as the film's primary villain, Derek Danforth. That sounds like a villain name. He's just this weaselly, whiny, and bratty tech bro who runs all these fishing farms that prey on all these people, especially the elderly. To me, he's like a cross between Farmer Bro, Martin Shkreli, and that media influencer Logan Paul. just the two of them combined, the worst aspects of their personalities are really just their personalities, because they are indeed the worst. He's just detestable, and it's fun to see him play a character like this, especially since this might be one of his only villainous roles that I've ever seen him play. There's nothing that immediately comes to mind. Outside of those good things that I think really did work in the movie has a number of problems. A lot of issues. Namely, and I'm sad to say this, Jason Statham. Outside of the action scenes, which he's obviously featured heavily in, he feels like he's on autopilot throughout this entire movie. Much like how he was in the last 3 films that I saw him in 2023. Both, I mean, Expendables, no doubt about it. That was a dying franchise, and that was very much the death nail. Meg 2, he seemed completely bored, and even in Fast X, which is too bad, because for the longest time I actually really liked him as one of the Shaw, Deckard Shaw. I liked him as Deckard Shaw, especially in 7. He just doesn't have a lot of charisma in this, to me. He's so stoic, and he's given very little interesting or fun dialogue to say. And let me tell you, and the dialogue in this film is not great either. And I suppose in retrospect, it somewhat makes me appreciate that there's actually so little spoken dialogue in the later John Wick films, particularly from Keanu Reeves, who seems to be getting just worse and worse and worse throughout that series in terms of his acting performance. But really, it just kind of made me miss the cheesy, fun dialogue of an Arnold Schwarzenegger action film like Commando, Terminator, or even Predator.
Yeah. Stick around.
They attempt to replicate that, and many of the actors in this movie just can't sell these lines, especially since they have to deliver just a plethora of B jokes and puns. Everything from to be or not to be, which might be my favorite, to other things like this is gonna sting a little, and I protect the hive. With Statham, I feel like that's the one that he says the most throughout this movie. So I need to protect the hive. When the hive is threatened, I need to protect the hive. That's his go-to. I think he says that the most out of any other piece of dialogue in this entire movie. And again, there's also just these attempts to be funny from other characters, the supporting and tertiary characters, mainly this FBI duo who are the secondary protagonists in the movie, and a lot of their humor just falls really flat to me. But as I often say, humor is subjective. It's the most subjective of genres, and you might like all the B puns and awkward, ill-timed sex jokes or references to losing one's virginity. It just personally didn't work for me at all. Jeremy Irons is in the movie. I was like, oh yeah, Jeremy Irons is in this movie when he popped up. And he's just, his whole, like, how I would describe his just personality is, whatever, man. Just pay me. I'll say the dialogue, and let's move on to the next action scene. I'll set up the next action scene where Jason Statham will be a badass and do his thing, which is weird because I think, like, after his experience making all those DC movies, he said, that's like, I really don't want to do those types of movies anymore. Maybe he just maybe it was just specifically DC, but he's like, oh, yeah, I'll definitely do, like, a shitty action film. Believe me, all right? Maybe that was the case. I don't know, but he's sleepwalking through this, too. And listen, I've talked about this a lot in the past, and we are very much in the era of John Wick. There's no denying that. Those films, both good and ill, have had a huge influence on action films being made for the last decade, especially, I would say, the last 5 years. Everything from Nobody, Atomic Blonde, Extraction, hell, even Bullet Train, all feel like they're in the John Wick universe or are borrowing extensively from it to various degrees of success. And I think that is very much the case for The Beekeeper. It attempts to create similar inciting incidents that like kick off the story, but also create the same world of assassins with rules. It does both of those things, and that's what kind of like the Beekeeper organization is, and it's very much like the assassins of John Wick, where this organization, they're this organization that's given carte blanche to pretty much do whatever they want to do at any given time. Like, no one seemingly knows about them, but yet they've managed to penetrate all aspects of society as well. There's even several scenes in the movie that are just right out of John Wick, such as this kind of call center that keeps tabs on the various agents. But it just doesn't do as much with the world building as the first two John Wick movies did. Hell, even the next two, which I'm not overly fond of. Those movies created their own world and personality and vibe. It just got a great aesthetic. It's interesting when we learn about the Continental, when we learn about the currency system, when we learn about how, again, like every seemingly ordinary organization that we come across in our daily lives, they have an element that is just connected, a branch that is obviously connected to John Wick and his world. And the Beekeeper is just kind of borrowing from John Wick, but it doesn't do enough to make its own world that interesting. It's just like, well, we'll take some of those elements that work for John Wick and we'll put them over here, but it's not making them unique in any capacity. We're just kind of pretty much left with this standard action vehicle with a solid start, a fun villain in Josh Hutcherson, and some good action sequences. But its main hero, its supporting characters, its dialogue, and its world building to me are all just pretty substandard. I did have some people in my audience, like, it wasn't like super crowded, but there was, certainly more people than in my night swim screening, which had no one except me. I was the unlucky schmuck just sitting there watching that movie alone. But there were a number of people in my audience, and there was like a couple people that were like, ah, like, during some of the kills and some of the lines. Like, so clearly it is working for at least the people that I've encountered that I watched the movie with. Though not all. So I am very curious to see if they are attempting to create just like a new action series, again, in the style of John Wick. I don't feel like if they're just attempting to rip John Wick off, I don't think they did enough. There's just not enough interesting things there to like necessitate a sequel, in my opinion, although they kind of, to a degree, laid down the groundwork if they wanted to. I mean, most of the stuff is kind of dealt with by the end of the movie. The threat's handled, the hive is protected, chat, right? As Jason Statham so often says, but I really just don't feel a need to return to this world. If they do want to return to it, honestly, I would prefer it if it's just a whole different creative team. David Ayer, I mean, there are some good action scenes in this, but even when I think back of a lot of like his best movies, like, Fury or End of Watch, right? Or some of his screenplays, which he's written, like Training Day. Like, I kept thinking about those movies while watching this. I'm like, none of that seems to be in here. Like, none of that DNA that made those particular movies work so well and be so special. It's like, yes, those movies had some really cool, thrilling segments or action sequences in the case of like End of Watch or Fury. There's no doubt about that. But they also just had these like really good character moments and conversations. That's the thing. And this one just doesn't really have that at all. And so if they didn't even say David Ayer directed this, I think most people wouldn't even know he did direct this. Like, none of his sensibilities and style is in this, There's no cholos in this. there's no Shia LaBeouf cholos in this movie, which is probably for the best. But at the same time, like, I didn't see his style. And though, to be fair, I don't think his style has really been on full display for quite a while, at least for several of his last films. But yeah, for me, despite, I think, a solid start and some good kills, and there are some good kills, and they're bloody, and they hold on some of the goopy, dismemberment, which is nice. So much of this just feels like another John Wick ripoff, which I feel like we're just going to keep getting for many years to come, for the rest of the 2020s. And listen, I like the first two John Wick films, but I don't want every action movie just to be John Wick, because then it becomes dull. You know, I guess, I don't know, after watching old school 80s action movies recently, like Commando, it kind of made me yearn for those days. But again, I don't think you have like an action star that has the charisma, or at least, you know, in terms of theatrical films, has the charisma of Arnold Schwarzenegger. I don't think Jason Statham has it. I think he's kind of tired now, and it's just not working. But that's just how I feel about The Beekeeper. What about you guys? Anyone else see The Beekeeper this week? Did you like the film? Did you hate it? You know, were you more kind of mixed like me, where you like maybe a little bit of it, but many of the other elements just didn't work for you? Let me know.